September 1942. A German climbing team battles its way to the summit of the highest mountain in Europe. Nazi Germany's elite mountain troops are boasting of their country's vast conquests by raising the Nazi war flag on the summit of Mount Elbrus, deep inside the Soviet Union. Hitler believes his plan for world domination is well on target.
I think people really did think that the Germans had everyone on the run in the autumn of 1942. If you look at the huge strides they make in the Caucasus and down into that part of the southern USSR, it looks like it's completely one-way traffic, absolutely.
This is the peak of Hitler's power. He has seized huge territories and enormous resources.
You've got to be aware of the extent of the German Reich by early 1942. It really stretched from Archangel in the north down to the Caucasus in the south. That is a huge landmass that they dominated.
But Hitler is greedy for more. His evil ideology demands that the German people must dominate the globe. No matter how much territory or how many prisoners his army seize, he's never satisfied.
The Nazi view of war was that it was essential for the health of the race, of the German race, that they kept on fighting, that they never stopped. It was war without limit and war without end. A nation without war was a feeble, weak nation.
Hitler's war demands an ocean of oil for his enormous numbers of tanks, planes, and ships. So the vast oil fields of the Caucasus are vital for his plans. He must capture them to defeat the Soviet Union and fuel even greater conquests. But Hitler must move fast. Despite Nazi propaganda, German industry is crippled by shortages of every kind, from steel to rubber. If Hitler can't capture everything that he needs for his war machine, his plans for world domination will fail. In 1924, Adolf Hitler is in jail. His attempt to seize power here in Munich the previous year failed dismally. Forced out of politics, he turns to writing. In his book Mein Kampf, he creates an extraordinary vision of how he plans to turn Germany into a global power. But to create world-beating armed forces, Germany needs huge resources. Hitler's plan is simply to steal them, especially from the countries which lie to the east of Germany.
If Germany is going to survive, then it needs to get resources from elsewhere. If it can't get those resources peacefully, then we have to get them by military might and military force.
Hitler believes that the land and resources of Poland and the Soviet Union are the German people's by right. But he can only gain this Lebensraum, or living space, by conquest. Yet, at the end of the First World War, Germany was virtually disarmed and its military industries crippled. So when Hitler comes to power, war seems impossible.
Muss man sagen, dass Deutschland eigentlich Stand 1933.
In 1933, Germany no longer really had an armaments industry. There was a small army from the Weimar period, but it had no tanks, there was no air force, and the navy had been frozen at a very low strength throughout the Weimar period. As for arms factories, they actually didn't exist at all.
Und die Betriebe existierten eigentlich auch nicht.
However, Germany's armed forces are not idle. Despite restrictions imposed by the Allies, they are working in secret to rebuild their combat power. They have plans for a rapid military expansion.
In the 1920s, the Reichswehr had already trained its men one level above their actual rank. So this helped to increase relatively smoothly, despite many problems, the increase of the army from a small force of 100,000 to 4.5 million.
The Weimar's army, the Reichswehr, always accepted that it was a transitory force in the sense that it sought to expand in the future and knew one day it would. They were forbidden an air force, they were forbidden a major navy, and they were forbidden tanks. That meant, of course, they had to think outside the box, and that meant they were more open to technological solutions to their problem.
The German military works covertly to create the very latest weapons that get around these restrictions. A fake corporation is set up in Holland to work on new U-boat designs, which are then built for other countries such as Finland and Turkey. Germany gains valuable intelligence, which it then uses to make its own improved submarines. Another German front company in Switzerland makes advanced machine guns. They will dramatically increase the army's firepower on the battlefield. So even before Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, rearmament has already begun.
Hitler does come to power in 1933 by saying, fine, we are going to rearm. But he doesn't do this in a vacuum. The plans are already there. The plans which the military itself has developed are really very far advanced. It's not a matter of imposing rearmament on an unwilling military establishment. It's basically taking the brakes off.
One of Hitler's earliest acts is to triple the size of the army. 2 years later, he recreates the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. He informs the world that Germany is no longer bound by the treaties that limit its military power. The time for secrecy is over. Hitler declares that the German economy will focus all its effort on rearmament. His first target is to increase steel production. Without it, none of the weapons the Army, Navy, and Air Force need will be made. Results seem to come quickly. October 3rd, 1936. Adolf Hitler witnesses the launch of the Scharnhorst. At 38,000 tons, it's by far Germany's mightiest warship, and its first new battleship since the First World War.
From Hitler's point of view, it's all about size, it's all about scale. Where's the fun in smashing a champagne bottle against the hull of a U-boat? Massive, great battleship bristling with huge guns. Then that's something he can feel proud about.
The Scharnhorst is just the first of Hitler's new battleships. In the pipeline is its twin sister, the Gneisenau. Later, two even bigger battleships are launched, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. At 50,000 tons each, they are among the largest battleships in the world. Hitler wants a navy that can challenge Britain's control of the seas. He is determined to avoid what happened during the First World War, when a naval blockade closed Germany's ports, starving it into submission. But there's a fatal flaw. Germany simply does not have enough resources to build a fleet anywhere near the size of its enemies.
The master plan to create a huge surface fleet is one of the most insane decisions that the Nazis ever made. What they have is a very, very small navy. They have very, very low resource capacity. They have huge demands for iron ore and steel and so on, which they are using to build up their aircraft, the Luftwaffe, to build tanks, guns, and all the other stuff to have a large army. What you absolutely don't need to do is to be sinking vast resources into a surface fleet of mighty battleships, which frankly are still going to come massively short.
In fact, when the war begins, Britain's Royal Navy boasts 15 battleships, as does the US Navy. The French fleet has 7. Germany's navy is totally outgunned, with just 4 battleships, 2 of which are very old. Hitler's thwarted ambitions for naval supremacy reveals a weakness. Germany depends on iron ore to make the steel for its armaments. the Nazis must become self-sufficient in steel and in the most vital ingredient of Hitler's war machine, oil. Adolf Hitler is presiding over a massive expansion of Germany's army, navy, and air force. But his plans for even greater military growth are being held back by a shortage of steel.
There was a real shortfall, particularly from 1936, in smelting capacity. The demand for steel was just too great to be met, not just for armaments, but also for new infrastructure.
New smelting plants are needed to turn ever greater quantities of raw iron ore into steel. But before it can be used to make new weapons, vast quantities of steel are first needed to build the weapons factories.
Also gerade im Bereich der Heeresrüstung und der Luftwaffe musste erst sehr viel investiert
To equip the
werden.
army and the Luftwaffe, first a great deal had to be done to build factories and provide machinery before weapons could be manufactured. Naturally, the steel industry profited enormously doing this. Building the factories required steel, so they benefited twice over, producing weapons and providing the steel for others to build their own weapons factories.
Und letztendlich natürlich zuliefern für andere, die beispielsweise Fabrikanlagen errichten.
German steel is famous for its quality, but the iron ore from which it is made is mostly imported from Sweden. To buy it, German manufacturers have to sell some of their steel abroad, limiting supplies to the arms industry at home. It's a vicious circle that Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring, is determined to break. He wants to use Germany's own iron ore, but its quality is poor.
Das Grundproblem bestand darin, dass der Eisengehalt zu gering
The
war.
basic problem was that the iron content was minimal, and so it just wasn't worth using. Also, processing it was very labour-intensive, so it was simply inefficient to use this ore.
Deshalb hatte
That's
man
why iron ore was imported from Sweden.
Schweden importiert.
Göring threatens the steel bosses with punishment for industrial sabotage if they don't use German iron ore, despite its low quality. To drive his message home, he builds a huge new processing plant right where the ore is mined in Salzgitter, central Germany, far away from the rest of the steel industry in the Ruhr Valley. The Reichswerk Hermann Göring will grow into the largest company in the world, a vast state-controlled steel conglomerate with 500,000 workers.
Das war natürlich nicht im Interesse der Privatindustrie.
That obviously was not in the interests of private industry, because it meant that the state had become a competitor. Privately owned firms obstructed this as much as they could, but in the end, the state forced it through and ended up controlling production.
Letztendlich betrieben.
But despite Göring's success, Nazi Germany never has enough steel for all its needs. It has to be rationed.
Man hat versucht letztendlich den Mangel dadurch zu lösen, dass man Eisen
They
und
tried to
Stahl
cope with the shortage of iron and steel by allocating it to the most strategically important sectors, to building armaments factories or to production related to self-sufficiency, such as synthetic oil.
wie synthetische Mineralölerzeugung.
Politz on the Baltic coast. These shattered buildings were once one of the most important industrial sites in Nazi Germany. This huge complex was given very high priority for steel because it produced the most crucial resource of all: oil.
The problem is that Germany has very little crude oil itself. It increases pretty dramatically during the Nazi period, but still minuscule compared to the needs of the country.
With very little oil of its own, Germany's world-leading chemical company, IG Farben, tries to find a way to make it synthetically. In the 1920s, it makes a breakthrough, creating a process to make crude oil from coal.
Mit chemischen Verfahren
Using chemistry, you can make a substitute for oil from coal. This was really important during the war.
kann sogar vielleicht sagen, dass der Krieg keinesfalls bis
The war would never have lasted until 1945 if the Nazi state hadn't been able to create fuel substitutes because it had hardly any natural oil supplies.
kaum Erdölvorkommen hatte.
But just before IG Farben can go into full production, it suffers a major setback.
The first commercial synthetic fuel plant in the world opened in 1927. And that's exactly the time when huge discoveries were made in Texas and Oklahoma. What happens then, because of the discovery of oil, because of the Depression, the price of oil collapsed. And therefore, it was completely uneconomic for IG Farben to produce these synthetics.
But when Hitler comes to power, he makes the company an extraordinary offer. He guarantees to pay the full market price for every drop of synthetic oil it can make. For the Nazis, these subsidies are worth it. If they make Germany self-sufficient, the country's shortage of oil will be supplied from its abundant reserves of coal. 12 synthetic refineries are built. IG Farben's chemists also develop another vital resource for German rearmament: an artificial rubber called Buna, also made from coal. It's needed for thousands of aircraft and truck tires, as well as millions of gas masks. It's also used in tank gun sights and watertight seals on U-boat hatches. German scientific skill is making Hitler's military buildup possible.
I think they're absolutely essential for his ability to actually take the war beyond German borders. It was essential to have synthetic fuel. It was essential to have synthetic rubber. It's using the one thing that Germany has in abundance, which is coal, and ingenuity, which it has in abundance in that particular industry.
There's no shortage of scientific brilliance, but German industry does lack coordination and planning. The Nazis' favored industrialists get the best contracts, but they often waste money on pet projects.
The whole structure of the Nazi state is one of private enterprise, infighting, divide and rule policy. Does not encourage mass production. So there's a lack of mass production, over-engineering, and a lack of focus on what was really required. For me, the absolute classic example of misuse of resources is the Humboldt gas mask case. It's so iconic. It's when you look at German troops, whether it be in a commando comic, whether it be in a film, whether it be in black and white photographs, what you see is that cylinder stuck on their backside. It's grooved, it's got a little hinge on it, it's got a gossamer wire and a little case for extra lenses in it. It's totally over-engineered, it's completely pointless. What's wrong with a canvas sack?
It's not just steel that gets wasted like this. Water canteens, issued to millions of German soldiers, are made from aluminum, even though it all has to be imported. And aluminum is absolutely vital to make the new fighters and bombers that will be the core of the most important arm of the Nazi military, the Luftwaffe. The Nazis are recreating Germany's arms industry, producing steel from local iron ore and synthetic oil from coal to fuel the thousands of vehicles their war machine will need. But Hitler can only declare war if he is certain of dominating the air. When Hitler seizes power in 1933, Germany has no air force. The aircraft industry employs fewer than 4,000 workers, who make only 368 aircraft that year, all civilian. To have any chance in a future war, Germany needs to rebuild its air force, and fast. For this vital task, Hitler once again turns to his most senior minister, Hermann Goering. In April 1933, the former First World War fighter ace is put in charge of the new Air Ministry. He oversees massive state investment, turning the aircraft industry into the most important sector of German rearmament. but almost everything has to be created from the ground up. New housing has to be built for the workforce, which grows dramatically to 60,000 in just 2 years. But for German bosses, all this effort is offset by the prospect of huge profits.
The way the economy worked in Nazi Germany was it was a capitalist economy with free enterprise, as it were. It wasn't like Soviet Russia where everything's nationalized, but it was directed and controlled, increasingly so, by the Nazi government for political reasons, and then pushing military production. The German aircraft industry, of course, was highly developed, but the problem was it wasn't centralized. It dissipated its energies across all kinds of different models, different parts. It was enormously complicated.
Hier muss natürlich auch berücksichtigt werden, zum Beispiel die Rüstungsindustrie.
The arms industry is just the same. Compared with the United States, it was certainly still using outdated production methods. In the USA, Henry Ford-style assembly line production had been strongly developed by the 1920s. This kind of mass production was still rare in Germany.
Massenproduktion war in Deutschland noch. Teilweise war letztendlich auch der Anspruch, dass man eher sehr hochwertig.
Partially this was because it was claimed German industry was creating better quality goods, but ultimately productivity was being neglected. So although it can be said that the armaments industry in Germany had relatively high quality standards, it was not able to produce weapons in large quantities. This was true in the 1930s and, to a large extent, also during the war.
Despite these limitations, by 1936, some of Nazi Germany's most iconic aircraft have been designed and built. The Bf-109 fighter, the fast twin-engine Heinkel 111 bomber, and the fearsome Stuka dive bomber. With these modern aircraft, the Luftwaffe can make up for the Army's shortage of tanks and heavy artillery.
The Luftwaffe provided a shield for the ground forces so that the armored forces and the infantry could maneuver freely. It was also used as a fist. So like a flying artillery, the Luftwaffe could support ground troops at crucial points and bring the decision.
But the German economy is reaching a critical point. It can't just keep making bombers, tanks, and other weapons forever.
There's no question that the economy ramps up very rapidly into the late 30s, but there are severe problems there, and everyone recognizes that would only be, it was only a preparation for going to war to get resources somewhere else to feed that economy. So it was approaching its limits, really, mainly in terms of raw materials.
On September 1st, 1939, Hitler launches the war he has long been planning. German troops smash through Polish border defenses. Bombers pound cities, roads, and railways. In just 36 days, it's all over. Poland has been crushed. It's a stunning victory. But the parades and propaganda films conceal the truth about Germany's readiness for war.
You could be forgiven for thinking that the Polish campaign, for example, was conducted purely by mechanized forces, because most of the footage is of motorized tank units. But even so, the main bulk of the German army was still foot-borne, and its artillery was horse-drawn, but you do not get a terrific amount of that on the newsreels.
France and Britain support Poland and declare war on Germany. Flushed with victory, Hitler wants to attack the Allies immediately. But his generals say this is impossible.
The armed forces were not fully equipped when war began in 1939 or during the rest of the war, so inevitably the problem got worse.
General Georg Thomas is head of the Army's Economy and Armament Office. In a detailed report, he makes it clear that the army is short of everything from ammunition to fully trained troops. It needs time to rebuild its strength after the losses in Poland before taking on France and Britain. Hitler reluctantly postpones the attack until the following year. But when the time comes, his first move is not against France, but Norway. He's keen to secure Germany's supplies of high-quality iron ore.
Der Großteil
The majority of good quality iron ore came from Scandinavia, especially Sweden, in the 1920s and 1930s, and ultimately right up to 1944. However, the ore was often shipped through Norway, so Norway and Sweden had a special strategic importance for Germany.
In winter, when Swedish ports are blocked by ice, iron ore has to travel by rail to the Norwegian port of Narvik before being shipped to Germany. To secure this economic lifeline, Hitler launches a surprise invasion in April 1940. Narvik is the scene of bitter land and sea battles before falling into German hands. They secure the rest of Norway in just 2 months. The invasion of Western Europe is just as rapid. German panzer divisions smash through the defenses of France and the Low Countries. The British army is forced back to the coast and retreats across the Channel. In 6 weeks, France surrenders. It's a lightning victory. But once again, the propaganda images of German mechanized might represent just a fraction of Hitler's armies.
The truth of the matter is, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, particularly when you're looking at the fall of the West, you know, France and the Low Countries in 1940, only 16 of the 135 divisions they use are mechanized, of which only 10 are panzer divisions. So that gives you an indication of just how under-mechanized they are.
And much of this military equipment is not German-made, but looted during Hitler's earlier land grabs.
The invasion of France was successful not least because the Germans had access to a lot of military kit that they were able to take from Czechoslovakia, which they took over in 1939.
Speed and brilliant tactics allow German forces to defeat its much more powerful opponents. This is the kind of war its armed forces are designed for. They can defeat their enemies before they can bring their much greater military resources onto the battlefield. The Nazis now dominate Europe, although Britain remains undefeated. But Hitler isn't concerned. He knows how to get all the resources he needs. He plans to seize them from the Soviet Union. Invading Russia will be a great gamble, but for Hitler, the ultimate all-or-nothing man, is it a prudent bet or a reckless roll of the dice? In a series of brilliant campaigns, Hitler has swept across Europe and secured Germany's access to many vital raw materials. But he needs much more, especially oil.
Clearly, the desire for more control of raw materials, oil as well as other things, is driving a lot of the military policy and the decision eventually in 1941 to go to war against the Soviet Union.
Everyone knows invading Russia is an enormous risk, but the generals who were so doubtful about Germany taking on Britain and France are now all in favor of continuing the war.
Hitler's victory parade after the fall of France made a big impression on both them and German society. So maybe this man is unusual, maybe this man is different. And so with Barbarossa, they go in with the benefit of the doubt. Hitler had made it work so far, why shouldn't it happen again?
But one military man disagrees. General Thomas prepares another report. It reveals that the army only has enough fuel for 2 months of campaigning and that its artificial rubber tires will not survive Russia's harsh conditions. Goering refuses to pass the report on to Hitler. He tells Thomas that with all the loot they're taking from the West, they cannot fail.
Thomas is one of the few in the army that really is thinking in those terms, and he is thinking very deeply about it and thinking, as it turns out, correctly about what the limits were of the German economy and the relation to military capability.
On June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union begins. 3 million German soldiers in 3 vast armies stormed towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. These cities, Hitler believes, are the key centers of communism. At first, the invasion is a stunning success. The German army kills and captures hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and seizes vast territories. The army believes the capital, Moscow, should be the main target. But after just 2 months, Hitler suddenly orders all efforts to be directed south to Kiev and the Ukraine. When his baffled generals complain, he tells them they know nothing of the economic aspects of war.
Hitler may have accused the generals of not understanding economics, but he didn't understand economics very well either. And basically, what you're describing is not so much an economic view of the world or an understanding of the world. It's really the raw materials, the goods, the power that comes through that, both in terms of consumption and in terms of projection of power militarily. That is what Hitler is after.
Hitler wants to capture the huge coal fields around the city of Kharkov. The war is depleting Germany's previously plentiful supplies of coal. And it's the railways, the Reichsbahn, which are suffering.
You have to remember that the glue that is holding the entire German war effort together in terms of mobility is not the Air Force or indeed Panzers, it is the Reichsbahn. And the reason the Reichsbahn plays such a crucial role is because it doesn't use oil. Steam trains operate with coal, which is one resource that the Germans do have something on.
The Ukrainian coal fields are captured, but Hitler's diversion has used up much vital oil. Other shortages reveal that the German military is not prepared for such a massive operation. The advance grinds to a halt, even before the winter snow arrives.
There's a long list of the reasons why Operation Barbarossa failed. For example, it will look lack of logistics, lack of resources, lack of reserves, stiff Soviet resistance, the constant shift of operational aims, so be it Moscow, be it Kiev, or be it St. Petersburg. But there was certainly one factor which did not play a role for the German failure: the onset of the winter. When the winter started in 1941, Operation Barbarossa had already failed.
Operation Barbarossa is the Nazis' first serious setback. Over 180,000 German troops are killed. The Luftwaffe also suffers heavy losses in both pilots and aircraft, which it struggles to replace.
The Luftwaffe is a symbol which epitomizes all that is successful and brilliant about the German armed forces.
Unsere Jagd- und Zerstörerverbände unmittelbar vor dem Start.
And yet it is in terminal decline by summer of 1941. It's been involved in every single campaign that the Germans have been fighting. It has been flying non-stop. It is massively overstretched, and no service suffers more from fighting on multiple fronts. And they still haven't recovered their numbers from the end of the Battle of Britain. So it's no wonder they're on the back foot, and they simply cannot deliver what Hitler wants them to deliver.
But their Soviet opponents are also suffering terrible casualties. And their economy is also massively damaged.
The losses the Russians suffered in 1941 are absolutely enormous, and they're also busy moving their factories to the Urals and also regathering their strength. So the German war effort is pretty full on, and there is no question that the German army in the spring of 1942 is still an incredibly impressive one.
Hitler decides to risk everything on another colossal offensive. This time, he aims for the Soviet oil fields of the Caucasus, in a final attempt to grab the resources he still desperately needs.
It was a very important objective, and it clearly was an indication that the synthetic industry is not able to supply everything that Germany needs.
Germany's synthetic fuel plants have been at maximum capacity since the beginning of the war, but they can only supply a quarter of the country's total consumption. The Allies have far more oil than the Nazis.
To put this in some perspective, the most the Germans ever use in terms of fuel is 5.5 million gallons in 1944. Now, British domestic use alone is 22 million gallons in 1944. That's not including Britain's war effort usage. So that puts it in some kind of, so basically Britain domestically alone is using 4 times more oil than Germany is for its entirety in 1 year.
Capturing the extraordinarily productive oil fields around Baku in the southern Caucasus would make a huge difference to Germany. They supply 85% of the Soviet Union's oil. In great secrecy, tank divisions are sent south to provide the armored fist for the attack. Its code name is Fall Blau, Case Blue. The operation begins on June 28, 1942. Stalin is so convinced that the next German attack will be against Moscow, the Red Army is taken completely by surprise. The first few weeks of the offensive go well. 1 million German soldiers, 2,000 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft advance as Soviet forces fall back. But then Hitler makes a disastrous decision. So confident of success, he doesn't wait until he's captured the oil fields, but orders an immediate attack on a city whose name will become notorious in the annals of war: Stalingrad. In Russia, Hitler's plan to seize vital raw materials to supply his arms industry is causing heavy German losses. But if he can just capture Stalin's oil fields, he believes he can still win the war.
There is no doubt that the move to the south to secure the oil supplies in the Caucasus was the correct move. But where it went wrong, of course, was that with the initial success of Operation Blau, the Soviets, for the first time, retreating rather than fighting to the death, Hitler thought that as a consequence, his belief in the innate superiority of the German army was triumphing over the Soviet Untermensch, and that therefore he didn't have to wait until he'd captured Stalingrad before moving on to the Caucasus. He could do both at once.
Hitler's plan starts to break down almost immediately. The Germans simply don't have enough fuel to keep their enormous forces moving. The Luftwaffe has to fly in supplies to stranded tank columns. On August 9, 1942, German troops achieve a small success when they capture the oil fields at Maykop on the Black Sea. But the retreating Red Army has wrecked the wells. German engineers can only get 70 barrels of oil a day out of the devastated facilities. The advance on the rest of the oil fields grinds to a halt. By October, even Hitler accepts they are out of reach. The Nazis' final resource raid has failed, but it likely never could have succeeded.
The operation in the Caucasus in the summer of 1942 is a fool's errand, because what are they going to do even if they do get to Baku and the oil fields of Azerbaijan? How are the Germans actually then going to transport that oil once they get it and refine it and all the rest of it? Well, the way oil moves around the world in 1942, and in fact still does to this day largely, is by ship. Well, the Germans don't have any shipping, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to move it because they wouldn't be able to get through the Mediterranean and past Britain all the way around to the Baltic and the North Sea to get to their ports. The only way that's going to move is by the railways, which are already completely overstretched and over capacity. So the idea that this is going to be their salvation is just never going to happen.
The failure in the Caucasus is overshadowed by the disaster now unfolding at the other objective of Case Blue, Stalingrad. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launch an offensive to surround the German 6th Army inside the city. The trap is closed in just 4 days. Attempts to relieve the 6th Army fail. The demoralized and starving Germans make no attempt to break out. After a 2-month siege, the last of the defenders surrender.
I think after losing the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, most rational Germans recognised the chances of winning the war outright were now ended. This was not going to happen.
Many people believe that the German defeat at Stalingrad is what ends Hitler's dreams of world domination. But his failure to capture the oil fields south of the city was an even more serious blow. Yet, even if he succeeded, Hitler's belief that Germany could loot its way to victory by seizing the resources it lacked was fatally flawed.
The problem is they're like kids in a sweet shop, and they just clear it all out and ship it back to Germany, all the resources, fuel reserves and coal reserves of France, for example, and then it's used, and then it's spent, and then there's no more.
The lure of more and more resources draws Hitler into invading ever greater territory, making more and more enemies. It's a recipe for eternal war, a war Germany cannot possibly win. But that's not how Hitler sees it.
For Hitler, the world is a black and white place with no grey area whatsoever. It's the 1,000-year Reich or it's Armageddon, and we're all in it together. And either the German people are man enough to be able to take on their enemies and win, or they're all going down, in which case they deserve what they get. That is his worldview. That's how he sees it.
The Nazi view of war was that it was essential for the health of the race, of the German race, that they kept on fighting, that they never stopped. It was war without limit and war without end.
Without enough critical resources, steel, rubber, aluminum, coal, and especially oil, Germany's fate is sealed. Even though its factories continue to hum, they are building planes that will never fly and tanks that will never run because there will never be enough fuel for their engines. Hitler's dream of world domination is over.